little bit of echo in this room. How's everybody doing? Okay, yeah. Didn't have enough snacks out there, huh? Well, thank you for coming. I know this is the last session of the day, so I really appreciate this really good attendance here. I'm also doing another session tomorrow morning if you're interested in Silverlight, or excuse me, Wednesday morning if you're interested in Silverlight, and that's a Silverlight 5 overview. My name is Pete Brown. I'm a developer community program manager. My whole group is called the Community Ninjas internally. I have the pleasure of managing Jesse Liberty and John Galloway and Joe Stagner back at Microsoft on the community team. Today we're going to talk about making your applications designable for MVVM. We're going to do a bunch of stuff here with Blend, but we're also going to do a fair bit with Visual Studio because you'll see that the things that you do for Blend also work for Visual Studio. For the demonstrations that I'm going to be doing today, we are going to use Silverlight 5 as well as, or Silverlight 5 Beta, as well as the most recent release of Blend. And in the back, why don't you start the countdown? Thanks. All right. Or else I'll keep you guys here all night if I don't have a timer. I don't think you want that. All right, let's get started here. So, slide 2 is a demo. That's always a good thing, right? So let's get here. I want to walk you through the application that we're going to be building as we go throughout this. I've got a bit of a shell of an application started off here. It's got a really basic user interface. It's got some MVVM type stuff inside here. I don't, or at least for the examples here, I'm not using a specific MVVM toolkit. I'm just doing everything basically from scratch. How many of you are using MVVM toolkits of one type or another? Fair number of you, okay. All right, good. Those definitely make your lives easier, but I don't like to show preference for one or the other because, you know, I know all those guys, and if I demo one of them and not the other one, that wouldn't be so good. So let me just run this so you can see. And this is the most complicated application you will ever see. It's probably equivalent in difficulty to most of the business apps you have to create, right? We are going to have an application here that has a list view on the left, or a list box on the left that lists some customers. And then when you click on a customer, it's going to show some details about that. We're going to do a number of things during this session. I'm going to show how to get design time data in there. I'm going to show how to get design time data that's based off your view model in there. We're going to do a little bit with commands, a little bit with behaviors, and also showing integrating your view model with the Visual State Manager and using some behaviors to help trigger that. Does that sound interesting? All right, one guy. Everybody else can go. This dude can stay. All right. Let me show you the code a little bit so you can see what I've got up my sleeve here. The application itself is a simple Silverlight multi-tier application. I have a service on the website that returns back data from a database. So using Entity Framework here, if I go back, because it's not a demo without Entity Framework, right? So if I go over here to the database and show the data, you'll see we have a few different rows of data in there. And the data just has a couple of names, first name, last name, some loyalty rating to say whether or not they're a loyal customer or not, and then some comments about that customer. Okay? We're not going to concentrate so much on the actual data itself, but more on the mechanisms of being able to use this in your application. Then if I look at the other projects I have in here, I'm using something that I commonly do in real applications, which is to have my model sitting in a separate library that has both a Silverlight version and a full .NET Framework version. And so that model exists primarily in the Silverlight version, but then the .NET Framework version has a linked file pointing back to that Silverlight version. In this case, it's just my customer entity, which has those same properties that we had in a database. And this is just a POCO object. I'm using Entity Framework POCO stuff, which I know isn't as nice as Code First support that we have right now, but it still gets you there and shows that you don't have to be tied to a particular framework. Then finally, when we get out to the UI project, I have the view that we saw, which currently doesn't have anything bound up in it. It just has our user interface elements. We saw right here, list box, some text boxes, etc. Code behind doesn't have anything in it. Although I will admit, I am not a stickler in the no code and your code behind. I feel like if you understand what happens when you put code and code behind and what you give up by that, it's perfectly acceptable in some cases. And then my view model, just thought I'd throw some politics out there for you guys to chew on. And I have a basic view model here that has the list of customers and the selected customer. And let me get rid of that breakpoint. And then a load customers method. All right. All pretty standard MVVM-ish type stuff. The thing is, this application is not actually doing anything at the moment. And finally, let's go and take a look at our service. And so I have a data service, and this is responsible for talking to the web service that's pulling the data back from the server. I'm using service in a generic term right now. So anything that's providing value that ends up being used by our MVVM. Typically, these are like libraries of functions or libraries of data or anything like that can get called a service. In this case, all this service does is it talks to that service on the server. Can I fit service in there one more time? Okay? All right, so let's get back to the deck. So first, a little background as to why we're doing this. So I was talking to the guys on the Blend team, and they had a kind of a really nice way of looking at it that I've decided to encapsulate here. So if you think about it, UX is not something that we've paid a lot of attention to in many of our projects in the past. A lot of times, if it's good enough, it's good enough. But that delta between a good experience or even an experience and a great experience is usually a gap that a lot of us haven't bothered to fill because it just wasn't seen as being worth the effort. But if you think about it, 10 years ago, unit testing and test-driven development and all the other DD, star DD type things were also not seen as being worth your time. Right? But now it's seen that testing of your applications is a crucial part of the development process. We're seeing some of the same things happen with user experience, where as people get more and more used to all the different types of form factors that we have with these great user experiences. I mean, look at stuff like Windows Phone 7 and obviously the iPad and iPhone and those types of devices. As users get used to those types of really, really slick user experiences, they start to demand it of your own applications. So whether you're building, commercial applications that are going to go out to the general public where that really matters and that's a selling point, or whether or not the experience is just something that's inside your organization and is going to make people more efficient, in both cases, user experience really needs to be part of the project. How many of you design user interfaces as part of your job? All right, how many of you slap a bunch of stuff on a form? Okay, well, you guys are designers too. Maybe not capital D designer, but you are designers. Every project, whether we want to think about it or not, has a user experience designer because somebody on that project is defining what that user experience is. Whether it's good or bad, and admittedly my example here is kind of bad, but whether it's good or bad, it's still a user experience. And you want to be able to leverage as many tools and patterns and technologies and whatever help you can to help that move from just a good experience to a great experience. I know you all are trying to change your business cards to say designer now when you get home. All right. How many have never touched MVVM? Okay, a few folks. For the rest of you, you're going to look at this and say, that's MVVM? You're missing like 20 or 30 pieces, right? But in a nutshell, MVVM is about the separation of your application into these different layers. If you think about the view is your user interface, typically XAML page or user control or group of controls, animations, visual states, all the things that help define the interaction with the user at an interface level. The view model is the model of that view. The view model it has all of the things that that user interface requires to function. So many of you are probably familiar with things like way back we used to just put stuff behind a Windows Forms form, and then you would call it the facade interface that it talked to, and it was sort of, kind of going down the same direction where we wanted to have a facade or an object that form was responsible for talking to, and it only communicated through that one object so that you didn't have to worry about all these other dependencies and, oh, where do I find the data and where do I find this particular function, and what about this logging function stuff? Where are all these things coming from? By having something in a view model, it enables you to encapsulate all of that. And more often than not, you're simply surfacing things that are elsewhere in the application, but it enables you to encapsulate all that and provide a single place that the view can talk to get its data to perform its functions. And then finally, the model is, in most cases, your data, right? So the model has your entities that have, say, like customers and purchase orders and all those types of things. And the view model is responsible for surfacing that model to the view. Now, I'm going to have my own view of model view model here, and we're welcome to discuss it and debate it afterwards if you would like. I know there are some folks that do not want to surface the model through the view model. They want to have a separate view model for every element in the model and surface it that way. That's also perfectly acceptable as long as you're gaining the benefits from that that you think you're gaining, and not just doing it because somebody told you that was the right way to do it. All right, so this is what scares a lot of folks off to MVVM initially. And really, MVVM is such a spectrum of a pattern that you can take it from the very simplest piece where you're not messing around with commands, you're not even doing anything with IOC containers or anything like that, and you in fact are just forwarding events to a view model. That's okay. That is MVVM as well, and it's a good stepping stone to get to these other more testable approaches. But when you start really taking MVVM as a whole, you have a view, you're using binding in Silverlight and WPF to get to the view model. You're using commands to call actions and to execute functions on the view model. If you're using a good MVVM toolkit, you're probably dealing with some messaging that can get information back to the UI, as well as between different elements, between different pages, between different view models. You may be invoking methods directly, or you may be using a behavior to invoke those methods. Events are still something that you can use, as I mentioned a second ago. And you might have other things like view model locators, which you're using if you want to really abstract out and decouple your view model from your view. Services, again, is a generic term here. It's not web services specifically, but you may have a service that's simply responsible for, say, calculating something. And that should be in a service as opposed to in a view model, where the view model is usually somewhat thin and, again, just surfacing these capabilities out from other locations. So services are one place where you might put different reusable bits of business logic. And those services can exist on the client, or maybe those services themselves proxy calls to other actual web services. There's a pattern called the service locator, which is, the VM locator is a specific instance of that, but the service locator pattern enables you to wire up services. So, you can basically say, I want a data service that's going to return data back, and you've got the locator will provide that to you. And the locator has logic inside it, or perhaps it's externalized through an IOC container or something like that, that can pull in an appropriate service for you based upon design, whether you're in design time, whether you're in runtime, or different environments, or different requirements, or whatnot. And finally, the model I had mentioned. And one of the key things that MVVM gets you, and one of the things that you really want to make sure that you're doing across your whole application, and also to understand the trade-offs of different approaches, for example, using events or having a lot of code in your code behind, is how testable it makes your application. So I think we probably all agree that we want our applications to be as testable as reasonably possible. Maybe we're not going to get that last 10% or something, but we want to make sure that we can easily test functions in our application. And doing that through a user interface is not usually the best approach. So we can do that directly through a view model, we can do that directly on services, we can do that directly against the model. All right, that's it for the MVVM primer. There are lots of good resources on the web for understanding MVVM. Again, don't get caught up in the religious part of it. Again, everybody has an opinion. It's a pattern that's still being defined. So if anybody ever tells me or ever tells you that you're doing MVVM wrong, you want to know exactly what they're talking about. You want to know, what am I giving up by the approach that I'm taking here, as opposed to just saying you're doing it wrong, or you should be doing it a different way. So I do that just because I know it scares a lot of folks off at the beginning as they're starting to learn MVVM. So where does Blend fit into this? Well, Blend directly supports binding and being able to use things like design time data. It directly supports working with commands and behaviors. It directly supports even being able to use our view model as a source of design time data, which I think is pretty nice. It's also there, obviously, for the user experience. So, you know, we talk about adding texture to our applications, and that's not meaning, you know, put the cement JPEG in the background of your application and call it texture, right? But we're talking about adding little things to your application that make it both more usable and more unique. So, for example, you know, little animations can make a big difference in the usability of an application. You know, the difference between displaying something instantly on the screen and having a little animation that sort of eases it out or pops it up or slides it in or something like that has a huge difference in how the user perceives the application as well as how they interact with the application. You know, if you can avoid just sort of just shoving stuff right in front of them and you can slide things in or again, pop things up with more of an animation, then it lets them focus, it draws their eye to it, they can see it, and it's not like suddenly something just appeared and it freaks them out. And I know most of you, I imagine, have to go through user acceptance testing at some point or another, right? No, there's one guy in the back that has you. All the rest of you are like, here, use this crap. I'm not listening to it. All right. I have found, I haven't always worked at Microsoft. I actually I worked for a living, you know, a year and a half ago. But I developed a lot of Silverlight applications and WPF applications and Windows Forms apps. And I found user acceptance testing went a whole lot smoother if your application was just a little bit nicer looking and just had like some little bit of eye pop to it. And maybe that's a sort of tricky thing to do. It's like, hey, here's my cool, shiny application. Don't look at these features I didn't implement. But it works. All right. And Blend itself was written with the MVVM pattern, so it's an interesting case in terms of how you use MVVM. MVVM doesn't come for free. You know, if you want to support designability and MVVM, you have to do a little bit of extra work. And again, I think you want to make your application designable to make the person who is doing that user experience, the person who's working on that user interface, that designer, you want them to be able to be as efficient as possible because they are part of the project. They're not the person that you throw the user interface to at the end of the project and say, here, can you take this and make it pretty? Right, which we've all done at some point or another, and I think we know how well that goes. They're also not necessarily the person that at the beginning of the project is just going to create a user interface, throw it over the fence, and then you never see them again. I mean, that works in some cases, but it's not the best approach. You want them to be able to be part of the project team and be able to you know, work with the application as it's going through. And even if the capital D designer goes away at the beginning and somebody else picks it up, you want to make sure that that person can continue to work efficiently throughout the project. So to do that, you need to, of course, separate your concerns in the application. The more hard dependencies you have, the harder it is for you to break things up and to make things designable, which we'll see here in a bit. You want to abstract away things like services. You know, if you're working in, say, Expression Blend and you want to have, you know, design time data in there, having a web service behind that is not very good. First of all, it won't run in most cases, and second of all, it's a performance hit, and you don't want somebody just to get design data on their form, you don't want them to have to hit a website and a real database and all that stuff. That might work okay for developers, but I think in many cases we would much rather have some set of hard-coded data or some small, like an XML file or something that we can both use for our design time data as well as something that we can use to test against. Something reliable and something part of the project itself. You're going to want to mock things, so you're going to want to be able to have these, say for example, a data service that returns data from that local file as opposed to returning it from that web service. By having those things mocked out and by using these different design time versions versus runtime versions, it makes it a much more designable application. And I like to throw IOC in there just because it's a cool acronym. No, seriously, using IOC, something like Ninject or Unity or any of those things is a way to accomplish several of these goals. And I'll show you where it fits in, although I won't be actually demonstrating IOC as we go through here. Now, the bonus of making your application designable is you're actually going through and architecting it well, right? Because it's forcing you, it's acting, you know, just like making your application testable, both of those are acting as forcing functions to help you separate and decouple your application. So let's talk a little bit about data binding. And I've got a few slides here that introduce a few concepts for folks that may not be familiar with it. So I didn't want to assume that everybody here is experts on binding. Remember what I said about if you're doing X, you're doing it wrong, and how that's religious and stuff? Well, I'm going to do it right now. If you have in your code some left-hand side, meaning like some textbox.text equals and some property from an object that you have out on your model somewhere, you are probably doing it wrong. And I say wrong in that you are coupling your code. You have a code behind now that's very tightly coupled with the user interface, and maybe it's also coupling with your model, and it makes it much harder for you to separate those out. You also lose out on a lot of features that binding adds in. So binding will get you a lot of automatic validation features. It'll also get you a lot with formatting and obviously support of MVVM itself. Binding is tricky to debug in many cases. So one of the things that I talked about in the Silverlight 5 session I did earlier today, and then also on Wednesday, is that we've added some debugging help in Silverlight 5 to help you with binding and figuring out where those problems are, because debugging binding can in fact be tricky. Now, if you're a WPF developer, and how many of you are WPF devs? Awesome, thank you. Let's show some love for the WPF devs. If you're a WPF developer, we don't have the binding debugging like we do in Silverlight, but what we do have is if you go under tools, there's an option for adding in verbose binding output that can either go to a file or go to your output window, and it'll give you a lot of detailed information for each and every binding statement. That can get rough. I mean, you get spammed quite a bit when you're looking at that. It's just tons of information. But it is at least giving you some information about what's going on in the binding system. The reason why binding is hard to debug is you don't own the code that's executing it, and in most cases, you're having to deal with text fields, for the names of properties, which if you misspell them, it fails by simply not displaying the data. So those are the two challenges there. But I think overall it's worth it, and I've also talked to some of the guys at Microsoft that created this and created binding, and they definitely convinced me that having the string-based approach in the framework itself was the right thing to do because it was the most flexible for them, and if anybody wants to build upon that and add other functions and features, they can. Binding is also not just for data. So if you're thinking about having interactions inside your user interface or things that the UI is going to do that don't need to really have any code behind it, you can often accomplish that with different types of binding. So for example, having a text box which displays the value in some sort of a slider, you can accomplish that with no code. It's just a binding statement that's using one element. And that makes it a little bit easier for the designer of the application to create a real user interface without having to write any code behind there. And I'm not against code, by the way, in case anybody's thinking that. So design time sample data is one of the things that we're going to concentrate on for a portion of this talk. Sample data is something that you can create in Blend. It simply creates a XAML file in your project that holds dummy data for your application. It's useful for things like SketchFlow and for some of the early application design on a project. We'll look at some of the drawbacks of using this sample data as we go through. But the way that you use it is you set this design time data context. That D : is a prefix that says this is a design time only feature. It was created by Blend, but most of them are also supported by Visual Studio 2010. So those are design time features. In this case, it's a design time data context that at design time will use this XAML file for its data. It won't end up in the, or it won't impact the runtime of the application because you will have a real data context for the runtime portion of the application. So I mentioned that it's good for some of the initial prototyping, and you'll see when we're going through some of the limitations of that. Over the long term of a project, which I imagine you guys have to support. Well, how many consultants in the room? All right, you guys, you know what you do. You can, I was a consultant for forever. You build the application, then you move on to the next project and let somebody else maintain it. So we're cool as long as it was easy to develop. But then there's all these other poor folks that have to go and maintain these applications. And there are these VB5 applications that are still sitting out there that have been maintained for 20 years or 15 years that we're only supposed to have a shelf life of 8 months, right? So we have to think about somewhat long-term for this and what we're going to do to make sure that you can continue to modify the user interface and continue to develop this application. Oftentimes, a view model locator or a view model version of this, or pulling in this data via IOC is a better approach than using this design time sample data. Again, though, if you're doing stuff in SketchFlow and very early prototyping, the design time sample data can get you where you need to be very quickly. And also, this data is not easily shared by unit tests. The unit tests need to be able to parse that XAML that's coming through there and be able to see, do comparisons against that versus what's showing up on inside the different view model properties and whatnot. And finally, the design time data versus what we'll do with mock view models and data sources and stuff is data only, just as the name would show. It doesn't have any support for doing functionality. So if all you want to do is put fields and test your binding and see how the user interface looks, that's great because that's exactly why that design time sample data was created. But if you want to show a little bit more interactivity and have actions that happen there and continue to work on the user interface as you continue to develop the application, it's not really the best approach. All right, so let's look at a little bit of sample data here. There we go. Okay. And again, I'm going to be doing some stuff here in Visual Studio and some stuff in Blend. So I've got Blend, and again, this is the latest version. It's a preview. Anything that crashes or any bugs or things that don't work, I'm totally going to blame on that and not on my own code. All right, so if I go to data here, I have no data defined for this project. But I want to be able to mock up the user interface for this application. And looking at this, all I see are some boxes and I see some fields here, but that doesn't really let me visualize what this is going to look like. As a designer, I want to be able to see what's this list box going to be like, and how many things are typically inside this list box, and how big do I really need to make this comments field. So what I want to do is add some design time data. So I can go through and say create sample data, and because I already have a view model defined, I'm going to create the sample data from a class. Now, you can also import it from XML, which will help. But again, that's an import. That's not a round tripping or anything like that. Or you can just define it directly inside here. By creating the sample data from a class, if I already have either model elements or view model elements, I can at least provide some initial parity between what's going to show up on the screen here and what's going to show, what's going to be in the code in the view model. Whether or not this works for you depends on how the application is developed. Some people like to do view first. Some people like to come at it from the back. All right, so let's create that from a class. Now, I could just create this directly off my one customer object. But that's not going to get me everything that I need. So what I'm going to do instead is go over to my sample. Oops, excuse me. There we go. And I'm going to base it on this view model. And immediately that's going to pull in all the fields that I had in that view model. Now, it lists that method, but we end up not really being able to do anything with that later. But what it has pulled in is here's my customers. Here's my customers collection, and then here is my selected customers object. So if I look at selected customers here, we see we have a string, an ID, a last name, et cetera. I'm going to let it do its usual lorem ipsum stuff here and not worry about defining that. But you can, in fact, control the type of data that shows up in there, the addresses, colors, company names, all that type of stuff. Okay, so we'll leave that there. And now to bind this, it's pretty easy. I'm going to close this. I'm going to take this collection that I have here, customers, and I can drag and drop, because that's a demo, right? So I can drag and drop that directly in here, and it'll create the binding statement for me. And then I can do the same thing with selected customer. And again, selected customer and customers are properties of my view model. I'll say, well, comments, I'm going to bind there, first name to the first name field, ID to ID, last name to last name, and then loyalty, which is our little rating of 0 to 100 as to how loyal you are to the company. All right? Now, as a designer, I'm looking, it's like, oh, great, now I can actually do some design work on this. And I see immediately, wow, this list box is ugly as anything. I want to be able to go in and lay that out. But I couldn't really create the template for that until I had some sample data to work with. So if I go over to customer list, and I say edit additional template, item template, edit current, and now I can start playing around with this item template, right? So here I'm going to see which field we're dealing with. So let's see, properties. Text. Oops. That help if I didn't do that? Give her that tilde. There we go. All right, now I have a field name text. That wasn't the intent, but anyway. So if I want to see what it's bound to, in this case, that number that I was just looking at there, that 40 is the loyalty. All right, so I'm good with that. So this 97 is the ID. I don't really need the ID on there. Let me see what this, and again, if I'm using data that's more representative of what I have, I would be able to just visualize it and see. This is comments, so I'm going to take those comments. I'll end up moving those down. And then the second one down here is the first name. Don't ever name your kids that. All right. So the next thing I want to do is I want to modify this. So I'm going to change this stack panel here into a grid. Really easy to do. Now again, if I like to type XAML a lot, but it's little things like this that make it much easier to work in Blend. Just being able to go in and say, all right, now you're a grid. Great. Don't have to worry about that. I say this was the first name here, so I'm going to take it, move it over. This one was, oh, that's the loyalty there. So we'll take that, we'll put it up here on the right. And then this one right here was comments. So actually, I don't think I want comments in my list box. So I'll just have these up here. And now, let me pull this over and also change the size of my overall. Oop. Come on. There we go. Oh, actually, I see. Here we go. Break that. There we go. You see Blend's being very helpful here by moving things. But that's my own fault. I know right now you guys are like, I want to be a designer. This is the life for me. Okay. Remember how I said anybody, whoever's creating the UI is the designer on your project? I said that specifically so I could get away with crap like that and still say I'm the designer on this project. But, all right, so what I've done here is I've gone in and created this data template for my list box based on the sample data. If I look at what's behind there, here's the data template that was created. You see it set up the binding statements for me automatically. And if I go down to, hit enter here so you can see this. Here is the design data, sample data, data context. So it's pointing to this customer information view model sample data.xaml. That's almost long enough to be one of our product names. And here's the XAML file itself that has the customer data in it. Okay. Now you can modify these directly if you want. No guarantees as to whether or not you'll still be able to use some of the UI stuff if you modify those directly. You can also go in, and if you create the sample data from scratch, you can go in and modify the values directly through some of the UI that we have. When you create it based on an XML file or based on an existing class, there are a few limitations to that. Okay? All right, so that's it for that particular part, and we're going to keep building on this as we go. How many of you have used sample data in your applications? A couple of folks, okay. Useful, not useful, you think? Useful for early prototyping? It's okay. You can say anything you want as long as you're agreeing with me. So let's talk a little bit about what we need to do to make this more design time friendly, and use real information from our application. So we looked at the design data attribute as part of that, our markup extension. But now what we want to look at is this design or data context, setting it to the design instance. Now, a design instance is a reflected copy of your class. So if you have a view model and you have it set to a design instance and you have it set so that it's is design time creatable is false, what Blend is going to do is it's going to go and look at the properties of your class, and it's going to create an in-memory version of that that has the properties there, but it doesn't have any of the functionality behind that. And actually, that's pretty cool, because if you think about what's usually in a view model, a lot of times that simply won't work in a runtime scenario. So if you took just a straight view model and said, I want to make it easy for you to bind to it, but look, it's calling these services over here, and I haven't separated these things out, and look, the constructor has this call that requires other stuff and whatnot. You know, realistically, in a lot of applications, that's what happens. So if you have this is design time creatable equal to false, again, it'll just reflect on that, and you don't have to worry about it actually executing something inside your view model. This works in Blend and Visual Studio 2010. What it doesn't get you is data. It just gets you the shape of the data. So it'll make it easier for you to bind to the data there and avoid all the typing mistakes and whatnot, but it won't let you visualize that at all. All right, so back to this. All right, I'm going to go back to my UI, and I want to get rid of this sample data here. So delete data source. Yes. I can save this. Now, when I deleted the data source, it still kept my binding statements, which is actually pretty helpful. So if you think about what you might normally want to do as part of an application and have you know, your design data just to get you through at the beginning, but you want to plug in something else afterwards, being able to just delete the data source and leave all your binding statements in there is a nice time saver. So you see we've got all those binding statements in there. This is also a reason why when you create your sample data, whether you do it from generating from a class or whether you create it from scratch, you ideally want to use the same names that you're going to use when you finalize the code. The same property names that you're going to use in the view model. If you just use a lot of dummy names, you're going to have a lot of binding statements to clean up afterwards. And you'll have to rebind them anyway. All right. So now what I want to do is I'm going to add in that design instance. So let me go over here, and helpfully a developer has left working code in the application that I just need to copy and paste. Paste that in here. All right. And here now, again, this is a design time data context. And what I've given it as a design instance is from my view models namespace, which if you look up at the top here, I have the XML namespace view model set to the namespace of my project, the customer information view model. And again, that's that view model that I showed you at the very beginning of the session here. Now, let me save this. I save a lot. I have like an Alt-FS or Alt, oddly enough, it's an Alt-FS twitch, not the function key twitch. So if I look at this now, and I have my, let's get back here, excuse me. Let me get my layout root. If I look at this field here, again, I don't see any data. There's obviously no data over here. But if I look at binding and I want to do the binding myself, I now have the picker populated with all the fields that were from that view model. Now these, again, were directly pulled from the view model. Also notice that it's got the load customers method, which will be helpful, if I set up, if I use some of the behaviors and whatnot later on. But it has all of these here automatically for me. And I think that's, even if you don't get the sample data, having the shape of your data available in Blend and available in Visual Studio is a real help. And most folks used to think that you could only get this if you went in and hard-coded a bunch of stuff, or you went in and had to talk directly to the database or something like that. But all you need to do is make sure you have some sort of a design instance available to you. So if I go over to my view here, and this is the same view, and I want to look at the binding for that, let's see, properties. If I look at text, look at the binding here, apply data binding. Here I have the selected customer, and I can also pick from here so I don't have to remember the binding syntax. Okay? And anything that reduces your typos when you're doing data binding, I think, is extremely helpful. All righty. Let's pull back here. Actually, let me, oops. That would be end. The session is not over. Don't get up yet. All right. I think I'm going to do one more thing before we get into behaviors and stuff there. So I've got this customer details here, and you see that it has initialized the fields anyway with some of the properties from that view model. Thank you. Screen. 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 There we go. I know if I keep hitting buttons, it'll eventually be that one. I want to do a couple other things here, though, to make this a little bit more useful, because we're not getting this data, and that's really, it's a shame to give that up from our, from the design time data that we were using before. But I really still want to use this view model. As a developer, I want to control the shape of the data that's going to be used to design the interface. That's my end of the contract. I want to own that, but at the same time, I want to support the designer in developing that UI. So if I go over here and look at my project, one of the things that I can do is I can look at a way to mock up that data. So I can take my data service, for example, and I can make a version of the data service that is going to just spit back design time data as opposed to runtime data. So in this case, instead of pulling from a database, it's going to pull from some hard-coded information. So if I go over to my data service here, look at this. I'm going to take my data service class, and, oops, excuse me, refactor, extract interface. Yep, I want all that stuff in the interface. So now I have an interface that I want to make public because it's going to yell at me in a bit in Silverlight if I don't. Now I have an interface for my data service. You can do this at the view model level, or you can do this at other levels behind it. The general consensus among a number of the top thinkers in this area tends to be to handle the mocking of these elements, the mocking of the data behind the view model, not at the view model level itself. It just tends to make it easier for you. And then you can selectively decide what you want to mock and what can actually stay in your project. And I use the term mock here in a very loose way. All right, so let me also add in a new class. And this is going to be my, let's see, this one here was data service, so this is going to be my design data service. Okay, and in my design data service, I am going to add in some dummy data for load customers. Let me implement this interface first. Might help if I actually type the interface. Oops. It's always the longest one that pops up. Data service. And implement that. All right, so here's my load customers. I want to have some dummy data come in there. So let me delete this, add in my load customers, and bam. Okay, so I just need to clean up a couple things here. There we go. All right, so now what I have is a dummy data service that has the same load customers method as the other data service. If I go and look at my main data service here, the load customers method calls that web service. And if I look at my design data service, the load customers method simply has this dummy data that's going to come back. you might look at this and say, all right, now I've got all this dummy data in my application, it's in my project, it's going to get compiled in there at runtime, et cetera, et cetera. And I would totally agree with you. That's generally not a cool thing to have all that kind of test code and design support code inside your project. But there are a number of solutions to that. You can use combinations of the managed extensibility framework to dynamically load different packages based upon parameters that you set up. Some of the mocking frameworks will also help you in that area as well, and some of the IOC containers. Managed extensibility framework seems to be the one that's the most popular at the moment for that, especially in the Silverlight world. And then you don't have to worry about having this in your project itself. You can break it out and have it in separate projects. Okay? So now I've got this, and I need to take my view model, and it's going to need to decide now which one of these to pick. And if in a complicated, I don't want to say a complicated application, in an application where you're really kind of eating this stuff whole, you would, again, use something like an IOC container, but also acceptable for a smaller application. I mean, the things like IOC containers and stuff get you a lot of benefits when you expand the size and complexity of the application. But something in a smaller application, you can do a simple design time, runtime check, right? So if I go into my customer information view model, and look at my load customers here, which this simply goes and calls out to that data service. I can put in a design time check, and I'm going to resolve this. And I can use this designer properties class and check to see if I'm in the design tool. And if I'm in the design tool, then I'm going to return back the design data service. Otherwise, I'm going to return back the regular data service. Let me save that, and I need to get rid of this. There's a lot of newing up of things here again. How many of you folks use IOC or dependency injection in your applications? A good number of you. So every time I put x equals new y up here, I know you guys die a little inside, but just bear with me. All right. So here I've got now this setup. I've got the design time check, and now I'm responding to this customer data loaded. And I am calling the load customers method afterwards. Because both of my classes have the same interface, I think we're good. Make sure I haven't left anything out. Now let me take a look at my view. Oh, I know what I need to do. I need to go into this view here and now tell it that it can, in fact, create that view model, because I've gotten rid of the nasty stuff that I know won't happen to work. So is design time creatable is true. Now I'm going to show this in Visual Studio because on the copy of Blend that I have right here, it's not actually populating on the screen, but it's the same code in Visual Studio as well as my copy of Visual Studio. It's not there in it either. Where do we go? Okay. I have backups if this is not going to work for me. D-data context, design instance, customer, is design time creatable equals true. I probably missed something, so let me pull this up real quick. Always have backups. There we go. Copy. Yes. Yes. This is not sleight of hand. This is fix my mistake that I'm not going to see on the stage. There we go. I only get the photograph when I mess up. Is that what it is? All right. Now let's pull this back up here. I always like preparing a solution. It sounds so scientific. Okay. And let's look at my view and look at the design portion of that. Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure what step I forgot a second ago, but obviously I'll make all these demos available to you. But the the data that you're seeing here on the screen is coming from my design time version of that data service. So this same design data service that I have over here that implements the iData service is surfacing information at design time on the design surface. So I think that's also very helpful. It gets us the same types of things, the same types of benefits that we had in a, it gets us the same types of benefits that we had in design data or sample data, but it gets us additional benefits in that we control that data and it's coming in the shape of a view model. Now, because I promised to do a little bit of other stuff around locators and stuff, if you look at this view model here, you might look at that and think, well, having this load customers, having this design time check inside my view model is kind of nasty, especially if I'm going to use this data class in several different places. So I can go in and create a very simple service locator. So if I go in and, let's see, add a new item, new class, let's call this the data service locator. Okay. And inside this, I'm going to have just a simple get data service method. Yes, it's static, don't beat me up. Resolve, put them all. And what this does, and the service locators are where you tend to see the most of your IOC type input or at least some of the other stuff that we were talking about earlier. This is where you're going to see the most of that integration. A service locator it can be as simple as something like this, or it can be as complex as something that, again, that externalizes all that to configuration or to MEF or to IOC containers. But what this is responsible for now is returning to me the appropriate data service for my application based upon, in this case, based upon the state of whether it's runtime or it's design time. If you think about it, you could do very similar things with different environments that you're on. I think many of us have had applications that had code in there that said, if I'm on the test server, then pull stuff from X. If I'm not, then it's going to go from Y. You can do the same types of things using this approach or, again, using some of the IOC stuff. All right. Now I'm going to go in and use this. If I go to my customer view model here, and instead of having all this junk, I can say iData service service. I'll say service equals, let's see, data service locator dot get data service. There is also another way to implement the not so much the behavior, but the interface of a service locator class. And this is really helpful, especially when you're doing the view model locators. And you want to make them available for binding. So you would surface, instead of having a get data service method, you would just simply have a data service property that you could then use inside, again, in a view model instance, inside XAML, so that you would bind the data context of your page to be your data service locator's data service property. All right, and that makes wiring that stuff up a little bit easier. And even though it looks like you're hard coding things because it's in XAML, it's in fact going through this locator here, and that helps decouple your application. All right. All good? Nope. What do we have? Oh yes, this was that error I was going to look at earlier. So that's my iData service. I need to make that public. Let's talk a little bit about behaviors and actions and triggers. How many of you have used behaviors in your applications? So a few folks. Okay, good. How about, how many of you have used commands out of curiosity? All right, that's just about everybody. Did you know? Okay, just want to make sure it wasn't a bomb announcement or something. How many of you knew, well, this isn't really a show of hands, it's sort of a rhetorical question, but did you know that in many cases the blend behaviors, or the behaviors that were originally created by the blend team, but you don't need blend to use them, many of those were made both to fill in the gaps for stuff like when we didn't have commands in Silverlight, and you could do things like have a call method action so that you can directly bind events that happen inside the UI to methods on view models and stuff. A lot of those were created to fill those gaps, but a number of them are still quite useful when we're building MVVM applications today. One of the ones that we're going to look at for behaviors here in just a little bit helps us out when we want to work with the Visual State Manager. If the out-of-the-box behaviors don't do it for you, like if they don't, if you feel like this bit of functionality should probably be in a behavior because that makes the easiest way to bind it to the UI and to get the information into the UI, but there isn't one out there that does it for you, take a look at expression.microsoft.com has the gallery there, which has a lot of third-party behaviors that people have created, one of which is an extension of a behavior we'll show here in a little bit for basically a big switch statement that lets you take different actions based upon the data that it's bound to. If those don't do it for you, it's actually really easy to create a behavior yourself. So again, if you understand what you're trying to accomplish, packaging up that UI code in a behavior and allowing it to be attached to other UI elements and allowing that as a point of glue or a point of interaction between your different parts of your application is pretty easy to do. All right. Call method action, again, is the big one that supports MVVM, and it's a little bit more than just doing commanding because it lets you wire up to different events. Visual State Manager is something that came out way back in Silverlight 2, and it was looked at as the way to get state animations and state changes for the UI out there. Before that, we had in WPF, we did a lot with triggers. If the mouse was over, it would trigger an event, and then we would change some part of the UI to respond to that. Visual states in Silverlight and WPF enable you to do that more declaratively in XAML. So you can say if the mouse enters my element, then display this particular, increase the size of my element by X pixels and spin it around and make it pink or something like that. Again, I said I wasn't a designer. It can also do things such as indicate things that are specific to your application. So you don't have to think about just the built-in visual states and just the usual hover and all that stuff. You could have visual states in your application that are based upon business information, right? So you could have the state of your screen change based upon whether or not your customer is past due on their bills. Rather than having code back there that says, if customer is past due, then change the background of the screen to red, you can simply have a state that says past due and bind it to that property of your view model using a behavior. So I think that's pretty powerful and pretty nice. So you can raise events from your view model and then have the code behind catch that, and you can call go to state and then directly move to a state from there if you want. That's perfectly acceptable, but the behavior approach tends to be a little bit cleaner. It's just a little bit more effort. Now, the go to state action behavior that we're going to look at supports only 2 states based upon a single value that we're comparing. Again, there are some other ones out there that support multiple states and being able to switch between those. So I'll show you the simple one here, and then you can definitely expand upon that. All right. So now, let me pull blend back up here. Make sure this is the right one. Yep. So I'm going to go into my project here, and I'm going to look at my view model. And I want to add a couple of properties here. I'm going to say, is the customer loyal? Remember we had that little loyalty rating that was a number from 1 to 100? In most cases, it's easier to work with the UI if you're exposing Boolean properties for different things. Now, you can end up with a proliferation of Boolean properties, so take that with a grain of salt. But in general, if you want something to change the state of the UI or to be bound to from the UI, it's easiest if you have Boolean properties for that. You can also expose state names and stuff directly from your view model, but that feels dirty to me, and I'm not really a big fan of doing that. So let me put in this isLoyal. So here's my isLoyal property. And then in my selected customer, I want to make sure that I'm calling iNotifyPropertyChanged. iNotifyPropertyChange is the bane of binding. It's just one of those things that we end up having to deal with. But what I'm going to do here is when the selected customer changes, because this is loyal is really something that's operating on an element of the customer itself, it in fact could have been a property of the customer as opposed to being a property on the view model. That's entirely up to you. But I wanted to add some additional functionality here without messing with my entities because those might be used in other places, right? So I have them here on this view model. And when you change the selected customer, I also call notify property change to say that this is loyal may in fact have changed. And the reason I have to do that there is because this is simply a calculated property. You'll do the same type of thing with other types of calculated properties like totals and whatnot. All right, so let me build that. And then I'm going to go into Blend here and pull up my view. And on my, I'll do it on layout root here. On my layout root, I'm going to add some states. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a state group. I'm going to say I'll call that loyalty states, right? And then I want to add a state. I'm going to say is, or I'll say loyal. And then I'll add another state called not loyal. Or actually, I'll make that not loyal and normal, okay? So on my normal one, I'm just going to leave that the way it is. My not loyal one, I think I want to change the background here to something that is going to, clue the hot pink. That'll clue them in. It's going to clue them into the fact that they need to pay attention to this particular customer. Wow, there's pink and there's pink. See, I'm a designer. All right. Like my wife, when we talk about colors for the house, I'm like, there's blue. She's like, no, there's blue, and there's this shade and that shade and whatnot. And I'm just like, no, it's all blue. It's all good. All right. That's why she picks the colors. All right. So now what I have here is this state called not loyal that displays the form in pink, red, whatever we want to call that. And then I'm going to set the transition here to be 1 second so it takes a little bit. And then my normal state just shows it in white. Okay? So again, these are visual states on a user control. They're not on some kind of other custom control. They're not on buttons or anything like that. And these are business-driven visual states. Right? I think before you go nuts and start putting all your things in visual states like this, you want to think about it like you would any other programming problem to make sure that you've got them grouped appropriately. Make sure that you have the states grouped in such a way that in any given group, only one of those states is active at any given point in time, and have other states to manage other types of properties. You can do states for like new mail arrived and any number of other things and use them to show animations based upon a state that you set. Some of the other things you can do with behaviors, which we won't look at here, but at least I can explain, is you can use behaviors to start animations, and you'll be able to do similar things to what we're going to do here to start discrete animations that are outside of Visual State Manager. All right, so I've got those states, and I'm going to go to my layout root here, and let's look at assets. Turn off that recording. And if I look under behaviors, I have this data state behavior, okay? The data state behavior lets me pick, based upon a value that I'm going to use for binding, it lets me pick a particular state to display. So if I take this data state behavior, and I'm going to put it on this layout root, and if I look over here, I'm going to bind this to my isLoyal. You see, because I've got that view model as my design time data, and it's still hooked up as design time data, it picked up, it picked up that isLoyal property, right? So we didn't have to go through and refresh any kind of data or anything like that. So I'm going to bind it to that, and I'm going to say true. And if that's true, then it's going to display normal. Otherwise, it's going to display not loyal. All right? So this is using a value that is in our view model wired up via a behavior to trigger a visual state change in the application. So let me save this. And because the design time data is not showing up here in this build of Blend, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio and go back to view, right this. And actually what I think I'm going to do is go in and add a couple of things so we can just see this at runtime. So I'm going to go in and have a real design data context. Control Z, there we go. So I'm going to pull this out and put it in my resources section. Sorry, my fingers are new. All right, there we go. So now I've got a customer view model inside my resources, and then now we're starting to move from the world of design time to runtime, and then I'm going to leave that design time I'm going to leave that design time context over here, but at the same time I'm going to create a regular data context, and it's going to be static resource customer information view model, because I like to type. Customer information view model, okay? And make sure I've got that closed, which I do. All right. Make sure I haven't left anything out here. Yes, I want to debug anyway. Oh, I got a breakpoint in there. Let's keep going. All right, so this one, my loyalty is 10, so you saw it turn pink. And what I haven't done yet, if you see nothing's changing over here, so one thing that was a little bit more difficult to do with some of the sample data stuff is to bind up the selected item property of our list box to the selected customer on our view model. So I can do that very quickly here. If I go back to my customer information view, look at that design, and click on this and choose properties. There we go. And there is a selected item. So apply data binding. And it's going to be selected customer. And for options, I want to have this be two-way, which was selected by default. And I'm good. So now what happens whenever I select a property, whenever I select a row inside my list box here, it's going to automatically update the view model. So there we go. Jesse's good, John's bad, Joe's good, and I'm very bad. Okay? All right. Some of the last thing we're going to do here, we only get a couple more minutes, is look at some stuff with commands. All right. Commands do for actions what binding does for data. You can think of it that way. It's not 100% correct, but it's close enough. What they allow you to do is to, again, decouple your backend, your view model, or especially in WPF, you can have commands that are just standard and exist all by themselves, but that's not that common if you follow MVVM or a lot of stuff in Silverlight in any case. What these enable you to do is to execute actions somewhere, typically a view model. They also can control the enabled state of a particular element in the UI. So you can use commands to, say, enable or disable a save button or an edit menu or something like that based upon whether or not that command can, in fact, execute. Commands, one of the big things that they enable you to do is to help eliminate all that event handler code that you have in your code behind. So if you have these commands that are sitting on your view model or exposed by your view model, they become more testable than having a lot of event stuff inside your code behind as well. And again, they do typically go to your view model when you're working in MVVM, but that's not a hard requirement. Commands are implemented using the iCommand interface. You're not going to work directly with iCommand in most cases. You're going to go and use somebody's implementation of a command pattern. A lot of the MVVM toolkits, or pretty much every MVVM toolkit, one of the most basic things that they offer you is a regular command, something like a routed command or a relay command that you can use in your application. The can execute changed is an event that, or a method really that you're going to need to call inside your, or from your view model. You're going to need to call this on your command to let it know that whether or not the state has changed so that this command can be executed and to enable or disable the appropriate button. And then the execute method itself is going to contain the code for executing that. And since we're pretty short on time, I'm going to pull up just the final version of this application. Yeah, I will in just a second. Thanks. All right. So what I've done in this version of the application is I've used a command class that I snagged from the web, this by somebody named, in this case, Frederick Norman. There are many different implementations of this, and again, the relay command tends to be a pretty good one, where the way that this command works is it uses predicates and actions. It uses basically the equivalents of delegates to be able to go in and let you provide other functionality for the command to operate. That way you end up with one command class instead of one command class for each and every type of command that you would have. And then my view model, I expose that command right here, where it's creating an instance of that command, and then it's returning that command back. And the can execute is seeing, if is loyal is false, then it can't execute. This command is checking to see, make you loyal. Excuse me. So if it's false, then it can in fact execute. And then what it does is it sets the loyalty to 90 on the execute action itself. And then if I go over to my UI, again, I don't have it open in Blend here, so I'll just open it right up in the view. This is wired up by looking at, yeah, whatever, I'll deal with that. This make loyal button has the command associated with it, so if I go back into XAML here and look at my make loyal button, here it is. And the command is right here. It binds to the make loyal command that's exposed from my view model. Now let me build this and find out what the heck those errors were here a second ago. Nothing. Okay. So let me start this, see if it all works. All right. So here I have the different ones. I did a slightly different version in this final one where I just have green if it's loyal and I don't do the red thing. This person is not loyal. So I can go over here and click on Make Loyal, and it'll do it. This person is loyal, so the button's disabled because the can execute is false. All right, and that happens automatically. You don't have to wire up any code to do that. And see, now that the person is loyal, and since I don't have the code in there to rebind that, it didn't do it. Since that person is loyal now, it's not going to enable that button. Okay? So in summary here, and we have just a couple minutes, but I'm happy to hang around for questions or chat with you out in the event that's going on here tonight. But in summary, I think designing for blendability or designability in your applications make it much easier for both other developers that are on your projects, as well as designers, whether they be capital D designers or those of us who are creating user interfaces. It makes it a lot easier for you to be able to go in and work on those interfaces over time. I think, looking at some of the stuff that Blend has for the sample data and stuff, just understand the limitations of that. Look at other ways. For example, I really like being able to have a design time version of the data that's exposed by my view model and being able to instantiate that directly inside Blend. If your view model is really complex and there's no way you could instantiate that inside Blend or Visual Studio, then you can also create a design time version of that if you would like. Entirely up to you, or you can add a couple of design time checks inside there. And again, I wanted to repeat that there is always a designer on a project. Where I think originally we decided, we tried to tell everybody that Blend was for designers and Visual Studio was for developers. We were never really clear about who's really using that. And the people who are really using Expression Blend are developers who are responsible for creating user interfaces, integrators that take stuff that designers have created in other tools and help make them into stuff that Silverlight and WPF can do, and some designers that are happy to work in our tool set. But quite honestly, a lot of the designers are still in like Photoshop and Illustrator world, and they're going to hand stuff over to you to integrate inside Blend itself.